Henry VIII wanted a dynasty that would outlive him. Instead, he left behind broken marriages, frightened children, executed cousins, dead queens, ruined ministers, and a court where even blood could become evidence of treason. This was not only the story of a king with 6 wives. It was the story of a family forced to orbit one man's fear. A palace could glitter with gold, music, and ceremony in the morning, and by nightfall, the same halls could carry the sound of locked doors, hurried confessions, and names whispered too carefully to repeat. To understand Henry, we have to step past the portraits, the broad chest, the jeweled hat, the royal stare that seems almost carved into history. We have to enter the rooms around him, the rooms where queens waited for verdicts. Daughters learned that love from a father could be revoked by law, and courtiers discovered that loyalty was never quite enough. Because the mystery of Henry VIII is not simply how he became cruel, it is how a king who claimed to be protecting the future of England could do so much damage to the very people who were supposed to carry that future forward. Before we venture further into the shadows, take a moment to subscribe, so you never miss a secret that history has tried to forget. In the Tudor court, beauty and terror were never far apart. A feast could unfold beneath embroidered canopies while, somewhere else in the palace, a servant measured every word for fear it might be reported. The king's favor could raise a family into impossible splendor. His suspicion could erase it almost overnight. And at the center of it all stood Henry. Not a monster from birth, not a cartoon tyrant, but something more unsettling. A charming prince who became a ruler so obsessed with certainty that he began to treat human bonds as problems to be solved. A wife could be set aside. A daughter could be declared illegitimate. A cousin could become a threat. A minister could be useful until the hour he was not. The dynasty survived him for a time, but the family did not emerge whole, and that is where the story begins. In a palace that feared its king, he did not begin as the king people learned to fear. That is one of the uncomfortable truths about Henry VIII. It is much easier, from a distance, to imagine the tyrant already waiting inside the boy, fully formed, merely growing larger with age. But history is rarely that tidy. The young Henry who came to the throne in 1509 was not yet the heavy, suspicious figure of later portraits. He was admired. He was educated. He was athletic, musical, religious, and by many accounts, astonishingly confident in the theater of monarchy. He had the gift every new ruler wants. People wanted to believe in him. England had endured decades of dynastic violence before the Tudors. The Wars of the Roses had not been some distant legend then. They were part of living memory, a family catastrophe dressed in banners and noble names. Kings had been overthrown. Princes had vanished. Great houses had risen, bled, and fallen. The crown itself had begun to look less like a sacred inheritance, and more like an object that could be seized if enough men with titles and soldiers agreed to seize it. Then came Henry VII, careful, calculating, and never fully relaxed on his throne. He had won the crown by conquest, not by a line of inheritance so ancient that no one could challenge it. His victory at Bosworth ended one danger and created another. The Tudors had power, but they still needed legitimacy. They needed heirs. They needed marriages. They needed symbols. They needed the country to forget how recently the whole structure had almost collapsed. So when his son, Henry VIII, inherited the throne, the kingdom did not merely receive a young king. It received a promise. Here was a prince who seemed to glow with everything the dynasty wanted to project. He looked the part. He moved through tournaments and ceremonies like a living answer to old doubts. He could speak to scholars, charm ambassadors, and dazzle a court trained to read every gesture as political weather. If his father had secured the crown by caution, the son seemed ready to make it magnificent. And yet, behind the gold thread and the music, there was a problem no amount of ceremony could erase. The Tudor dynasty was still young. That detail matters because Henry's later choices cannot be understood only as appetite, lust, vanity, or cruelty, though all of those words have been used around him, sometimes fairly. Beneath the surface was a colder fear that England could slide backward into dynastic chaos if the succession failed. A king without a secure heir was not simply a private disappointment. It was a public danger. Every cradle in the royal nursery carried political weight. Every pregnancy was watched not just by ladies of the chamber, but by diplomats, nobles, foreign rulers, and families who knew that an uncertain throne could make ambitious bloodlines suddenly relevant again. This was the inheritance Henry carried, even when he looked like the most fortunate man in Christendom. He had not been raised as the first son. His elder brother Arthur had once stood before him in the line of succession. Arthur's death changed Henry's life completely, turning him from spare prince into the future of the Tudor name. That kind of transformation leaves a mark. It teaches a family that fate can rearrange everything with one illness, one funeral, one empty room. And so the young king stepped into power with a strange combination of abundance and anxiety. He had youth, charm, money, and adoration. He also had a crown that still remembered the battlefield. This is where the familiar image of Henry begins to split. On one side, the Golden Prince, laughing, jousting, composing, praying, hunting, performing kingship with almost impossible energy. On the other, the son of a dynasty that knew it was not invincible. The more brilliant the surface became, the more essential the hidden demand grew beneath it. He had to continue the line, not someday, not vaguely, not as a decorative hope written into court poetry. He had to produce heirs who could silence every rival claim before it was spoken. That pressure did not excuse what Henry would later do. It does, however, explain why the question of children became something larger than family life. For Henry, fatherhood was never only fatherhood. Marriage was never only marriage. A son was not only a son. A son was insurance against civil war. A daughter, however loved at moments, could become a legal complication. A wife's body could become a political landscape, read anxiously for signs of divine favor or dynastic failure. It is a grim way to think about a family. But in Henry's world, private tenderness and national survival were tangled together so tightly that separating them may have seemed impossible. That was the shadow behind the young king's brightness. Not madness. Not yet. A fear inherited before he fully understood it, polished beneath the ceremonies, waiting for disappointment to give it shape. For almost 20 years, Catherine of Aragon was not a discarded woman in the corner of Henry's story. She was the queen. That distinction matters. Later memory often flattens her into the first wife, the obstacle, the sorrowful figure standing in the doorway, while Anne Boleyn waits beyond it. But Catherine's life in England had begun long before the famous crisis. She had come as a Spanish princess, daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella, Raised in a world where monarchy, faith, diplomacy, and family were not separate ideas. She had first married Henry's elder brother, Arthur. After Arthur's death, she remained in England through years of uncertainty, her future suspended between treaties, money, politics, and the careful calculations of men who treated royal women as bridges between kingdoms. Then Henry married her. At first, the match seemed not like tragedy, but restoration. Catherine was dignified, devout, educated, and politically experienced in ways that the young Henry may not have fully appreciated at the beginning. She was not merely a royal ornament. In 1513, while Henry was campaigning in France, Catherine acted as regent in England, and during that period English forces defeated the Scots at Flodden. The victory was not hers alone, of course. War is never that simple, but it shows something essential about her position. She could be trusted with authority. She understood the performance and responsibility of queenship. For years, she and Henry appeared to the world as a successful royal couple. But dynasties are not judged by appearances. They are judged by children. And here, the marriage began to crack in the cruelest possible way. Not through one disaster, but through repetition. Catherine became pregnant more than once. Hopes rose. Bells might be readied, prayers offered, messages prepared. Then came loss. A daughter was stillborn. Sons died. Infants who should have steadied the Tudor future disappeared almost as soon as they arrived. There is a particular kind of grief in royal childbirth that modern storytelling sometimes misses. It was intensely personal, and yet never allowed to remain private. Catherine's body became a matter of national attention. Her pregnancies were not simply family events. They were watched as signs of God's favor, diplomatic security, and political survival. Every failure invited interpretation. Every loss had to be absorbed in public, beneath the gaze of a court trained to notice weakness. One child survived. Mary. For Catherine, Mary was not a consolation prize. She was a daughter, a living child, a princess of Tudor and Spanish blood. For Henry, at least for a time, Mary could be celebrated. She could be educated, displayed, cherished in formal ways. But in the arithmetic of Tudor anxiety, a daughter did not end the problem. England had seen powerful women in royal lines before, but the idea of a reigning queen still frightened many political imaginations. A female succession could invite foreign marriage, noble rivalry, or claims from men who believed themselves better suited to rule. This is not to say Henry never loved Mary. That would be too simple and probably untrue. The more painful possibility is that affection existed, but was forced to live beneath dynastic fear. Henry could be proud of Mary's intelligence, her bearing, her music, her royal education. He could also look at her and see uncertainty. That is the tragedy of royal childhood in this world. A child could be loved and still judged insufficient by the needs of the crown. As the years passed, Catherine grew older. The hope for another healthy son faded. Henry, meanwhile, began to look backward through his marriage for an explanation that would satisfy both his conscience and his ambition. The issue centered on Catherine's first marriage to Arthur. Had that marriage truly been consummated? Catherine maintained that it had not been. A papal dispensation had allowed her marriage to Henry. For many years, Henry had accepted that arrangement. But acceptance is not the same as peace. When the male heir did not come, Henry's mind returned to the old question with new intensity. He began to see his marriage not merely as unfortunate, but as possibly unlawful in the eyes of God. The absence of a surviving son became, in his interpretation, a verdict. It is here that personal anguish, religious fear, and political convenience begin to blend so closely that no clean separation is possible. Was Henry truly tormented by conscience? Was he using conscience to sanctify desire? Was it both? The evidence allows room for complexity, and complexity is more disturbing than a simple lie. Henry lived in an age that took divine judgment seriously. He also lived as a king accustomed to seeing his wants treated as matters of state. By the time he sought to end the marriage, he could frame the decision as spiritual necessity, dynastic duty, and political prudence all at once. Catherine refused to become a quiet mistake. That refusal changed the emotional temperature of the story. She did not accept Henry's argument that their marriage had been invalid. She did not agree to vanish politely so the king could begin again with a younger woman and a cleaner conscience. Her position was grounded in memory, faith, dignity, and survival. Not only her own survival, but Mary's. If Catherine's marriage was declared invalid, then Mary's status would be damaged with it. A queen could be set aside. A daughter could be pushed into legal uncertainty. So Catherine stood her ground. And Henry, who wanted certainty, met resistance from the one person whose surrender would have made his path easiest. This is why Catherine should not be understood as merely the first casualty of Henry's marital history. She was the first great test of whether family could resist the king's need to rewrite reality. Her marriage had once symbolized alliance, legitimacy, and hope. Now it became a trap Henry believed he had to escape. The language around the crisis was legal and theological: annulment, dispensation, consummation, scripture, jurisdiction, conscience. But beneath all of it was something more human and more brutal. A woman who had given most of her adult life to England was being told that her marriage had never truly existed. A daughter who had been born a princess was being moved toward a future where her place could be questioned. And a king who feared the collapse of his dynasty began to discover that the fastest way to protect a family line was, paradoxically, to break the family standing in front of him. Catherine's tragedy was not that she failed as queen. It was that she succeeded for years in every way except the one Henry decided mattered most. And once that judgment hardened in him, the first crack in the Tudor family became something wider, sharper, and impossible to hide. By the late 1520s, Henry's private life had become a problem no one in England could safely call private anymore. A royal marriage was never simply a romance, of course. It was a treaty with a bedchamber attached. It carried alliances, inheritances, ceremonies, expectations, and the quiet pressure of every noble family watching from the edges. But what happened with Henry and Catherine became something stranger and more dangerous. A crisis that began with one man's marriage would be stretched until it reached the courts of Europe. The authority of the Pope, the loyalty of bishops, the conscience of subjects, and the daily rhythm of English religious life. Henry wanted his marriage to Catherine annulled. That word is important. He was not asking, at least in formal terms, for a divorce in the modern sense. He argued that the marriage had never been valid at all, because Catherine had previously been married to his brother Arthur. The matter turned on law, scripture, papal authority, and the contested question of what had truly happened in Catherine and Arthur's brief marriage. Catherine insisted that her first marriage had not been consummated. Henry came to insist that his union with her had offended divine law. At one level, this was theology. At another, it was strategy. At another still, it was desire. Anne Boleyn had entered the king's attention, and she was not willing to become merely another royal mistress. That decision, whether from ambition, conviction, calculation, or some combination of all three, changed her place in the story. Henry's longing for Anne did not create his anxiety about the succession, but it gave that anxiety a face, a direction, and a new urgency. The hope of a son could now be imagined through a different woman. And once Henry imagined that solution, the machinery of power began to move toward it. The problem was that Rome would not simply give him what he wanted. The Pope was not operating in a vacuum. Catherine was the aunt of Emperor Charles V, one of the most powerful rulers in Europe. Political pressure, legal caution, religious authority, and international diplomacy all pressed against Henry's demand. What might have seemed to Henry like a righteous correction of a troubled marriage became, from Rome's side, a decision with consequences far beyond England. Henry was not used to being refused indefinitely. There is a revealing transformation here. At first, the king sought permission within the existing system. He wanted the old authority to validate his new future. He wanted the Pope to say, in effect, that Henry had been right to doubt the marriage, right to seek release, right to begin again. But when that approval did not come, Henry's argument shifted from asking authority to redefining it. If Rome would not solve the king's problem, then perhaps Rome itself was the problem. This is one of the great turning points in English history, but it should not be made too neat. The break with Rome was not only a love story, and not only a theological awakening, and not only a political coup. It contained pieces of all of these. Reformist ideas were already circulating. Criticism of clerical wealth and papal jurisdiction did not begin with Henry's desire for Anne. Learned men could provide arguments that the English crown had ancient rights over the English church. Parliament could turn royal pressure into statute. Ambitious officials could see opportunity in religious change. But at the center was still the king's body, the king's marriage, the king's heir. That is what makes the story so unsettling. A question that might have remained within the royal household became a national reordering of obedience. Bishops, lawyers, courtiers, scholars, monks, diplomats, and common subjects were drawn into the orbit of Henry's need. The conscience of the king became a matter everyone else was expected to acknowledge, and conscience, in Henry's hands, could be remarkably forceful. He did not simply want a new wife. He wanted the moral architecture of the kingdom to agree that the old wife had never truly been his. He wanted the law to confirm what desire and fear had already decided. He wanted Catherine's resistance overcome not by persuasion alone, but by an entire structure of authority built around his conclusion. This is where family begins to disappear into paperwork. A marriage could be examined, dissolved, erased. A queen could be renamed. A daughter's legitimacy could be made vulnerable by legal reasoning written in careful hands. Words on parchment began to do what swords had once done more openly. Separate people from status, protection, inheritance, and identity. Thomas Cranmer, Thomas Cromwell, and others would become essential in this transformation, though each played a different role and not all at once. The king needed men who could turn pressure into process. He needed arguments, commissions, statutes, sermons, oaths. He needed the country taught that obedience to him in this matter was not betrayal of God, but service to a proper order. For many, this was not convincing. It was frightening. Because when the king's marriage became a test of loyalty, silence itself became complicated. To support Catherine too openly was dangerous. To deny the king's supremacy was dangerous. To hesitate in the wrong room before the wrong listener could make a person seem suspect. The court learned to study the direction of power with even greater care. Old friendships became delicate. Religious conviction became political evidence. The boundary between belief and treason began to thin. Henry's genius, if we may use that uncomfortable word, was not that he invented royal power. It was that he understood how to make his personal crisis impossible for others to ignore. He pulled the kingdom into the argument until neutrality became nearly impossible. And yet, there is a human pettiness underneath the grandeur of the constitutional language. We can speak of sovereignty, jurisdiction, ecclesiastical reform, and the authority of Parliament. We should. These things mattered profoundly. But somewhere inside the machinery was a man who could not bear that his first marriage had failed to produce the son he wanted, and could not accept that any authority outside himself might have the final word. So the king, who had once sought approval from Rome, became the king who rejected Rome's right to approve. The shift was enormous. England's religious life had been tied to the wider Catholic world for centuries. The change did not happen in one clean stroke, and it did not mean that England instantly became Protestant in any simple sense. Henry himself remained conservative in many religious beliefs, but institutional allegiance was broken. The crown took control. The king stood at the head of the church in his realm, all for a future that still depended on a child not yet born. That is the sharp irony. Henry turned desire into law, and law into obedience, before knowing whether the new order would give him what he wanted. The kingdom changed first. The heir would have to come later. By the time the path was clear for Anne Boleyn, the damage had already spread far beyond Catherine's chamber. The old queen had been displaced. Mary's world had been shaken. Subjects had been asked to reorder their loyalties. Men and women who could not follow the king's conscience were pushed toward danger. And Henry had learned a lesson that would shape the rest of his reign. If a family bond stood in the way of dynastic certainty, it could be broken. If a law stood in the way, it could be rewritten. If an institution stood in the way, it could be brought to its knees. The marriage crisis did not merely reveal Henry's will, it trained it. Anne Boleyn is often introduced as if she were a storm. Temptation arrives. The king loses his senses, a queen falls, a church breaks, England changes forever. It is a tempting version of the story because it is simple, and because it places almost supernatural power in the hands of one woman. But it also hides more than it reveals. Anne did not walk into a stable world and ruin it. She entered a court already full of pressure, a king afraid of dynastic failure, a marriage under theological attack, a nobility trained to survive by reading the king's face, and a religious culture beginning to strain beneath old authorities. Anne mattered enormously, but not because she bewitched a helpless king. She mattered because she became the place where several dangerous forces met. She was intelligent, sharp, educated in the manners and politics of continental courts. She had spent time in the Netherlands and France, absorbing a style of refinement that made the English court seem, at moments, a little less polished by comparison. She understood presentation. She understood delay. She understood that a woman near royal power could be admired, resented, watched, and hunted almost at once. And unlike many women who passed through Henry's attention, Anne did not settle into the role of mistress. That refusal has been interpreted in many ways. Some have seen calculation. Some have seen principle. Some have seen ambition shaped by the limited choices available to a woman whose reputation, once damaged, could not easily be repaired. Perhaps all of these interpretations contain a piece of the truth. What we can say with more confidence is that Anne's position became extraordinary because she held the king's desire in suspense long enough for it to become political. Henry did not merely want her. He began to build a future around her. This is where Anne becomes dangerous to the old order. She was not simply replacing Catherine in Henry's bed. She was displacing a queen with deep European connections, challenging Mary's place in the succession, encouraging or at least benefiting from reformist currents at court, and standing at the center of a rearrangement that many people found shocking, sinful, or reckless. To Catherine's supporters, Anne could appear as an intruder. To reform-minded courtiers, she could appear as an opening. To conservative nobles and churchmen, she could appear as a threat wrapped in silk. To Henry, for a time, she appeared as deliverance. That is a heavy burden for any human being to carry. When Anne finally became queen, her victory was real, but it was not secure. The ceremonies could proclaim her elevation. The law could reshape succession. The court could bow. Yet ceremony does not erase memory. There were people who still regarded Catherine as the true queen. There were people who still saw Mary as the rightful princess. There were foreign observers who treated the new marriage as scandal rather than settlement. Anne wore the crown in a kingdom where many had learned the cost of saying what they thought. Then came the child, not a son. Elizabeth. The birth of Elizabeth in 1533 is one of those moments that later history makes almost impossibly ironic. To us, Elizabeth is not a disappointment. She is Elizabeth I, the future queen whose reign would become one of the defining chapters of English memory. We know the portraits, the speeches, the armada, the mythology carefully built around her image. We know she would survive the very machinery that had tried to reduce her to a problem. But Henry did not know that. Anne did not know that. The court did not know that. In that moment, Elizabeth was a daughter where a son had been expected. Her birth did not destroy Anne's position immediately. That would be too crude a reading. Royal couples could hope for more children. A first daughter could be followed by a prince. The nursery still had time. The body could still promise what politics demanded. But the air had changed. The new marriage had been justified by urgency. Catherine had been set aside. Rome defied. Mary displaced. The kingdom's religious allegiance transformed, and the king's conscience made into public law. After so much disruption, the expected reward was not simply a healthy child. It was a male heir who would silence criticism by existing. Elizabeth's existence did not silence it. Anne now faced the same cruel measure that had been used against Catherine, only faster. Where Catherine had endured years of marriage before Henry's doubts hardened into action, Anne had been raised so high and at such cost that disappointment gathered around her more quickly. Her enemies did not need to invent the pressure. They only had to wait for it to become useful, and Anne had enemies. Some disliked her religious influence. Some resented the rise of the Boleyn family. Some had personal grudges. Some were attached to Mary. Some feared the direction of reform. Some simply understood that a queen without a son was vulnerable, especially when the king who had made her could unmake nearly anything. Anne's temperament did not make survival easier. She could be witty, compelling, and gracious, but also direct, proud, and politically exposed. The same qualities that helped her rise could be turned against her once the king's affection cooled. In a court that prized obedience wrapped in elegance, sharpness could be remembered as insolence. Intelligence could be recast as manipulation. Influence could be renamed conspiracy. This is a pattern worth noticing. Power near Henry was never stable. It depended not only on what a person had done, but on what Henry needed to believe about them at any given moment. Catherine had once been a beloved and honored wife, then became the living evidence of a marriage the king wished to declare invalid. Mary had once been celebrated as a princess, then became a reminder of an old claim. Anne had once embodied the hope of renewal. Without a son, she began to risk becoming the symbol of another failed promise. The king's desire had lifted her beyond ordinary reach. The king's disappointment would leave her with very little protection. Still, we should not rush too quickly toward the scaffold. Anne's queenship was not merely a waiting room before death. She acted. She patronized. She intervened. She occupied space in politics and religion. She cultivated alliances and made enemies in doing so. Her story is not meaningful only because it ended violently. It is meaningful because for a brief period, she helped change the direction of England while standing in a position that was almost impossible to hold. To be queen in Henry's court was to be visible from every angle. Every pregnancy was public hope. Every miscarriage, whispered calculation. Every disagreement with the king, potential evidence of pride. Every kindness to reformers, a sign to one faction and a warning to another. Anne's tragedy lies partly in the fact that she reached the summit just as the summit itself became unstable. The laws that had made room for her had also proved that laws could be remade. The arguments that had removed Catherine had also shown that a queen's status could be attacked through conscience, scripture, and politics. The court had watched one royal marriage be dismantled. It had learned the method, and Henry had learned something even more dangerous. He had learned that the unimaginable could be done, provided it was dressed properly in legal form. By 1536, Anne's position was under strain. She had not produced the living son Henry wanted. Catherine of Aragon had died in January of that year, removing one old complication while sharpening another. If Catherine was gone, Henry's marriage to Anne no longer had to exist in rivalry with a living former queen. Yet Anne's security did not improve. In some ways, it became more fragile, because the question became simpler and colder. Could Anne give the king the future he wanted? Or had Henry once again mistaken desire for destiny? The evidence for Anne's inner life in these final months must be handled carefully. Later stories, hostile reports, and dramatic retellings have all tried to fill the gaps. We should be wary of pretending we can stand beside her and read every thought. What we can see is the tightening circle. A king increasingly dissatisfied, factions alert for advantage, a queen whose confidence could now be used against her, and a court where survival often depended on sensing danger before it had a name. Anne Boleyn changed England, but not in the clean, triumphant way her supporters might have hoped. She helped open a door that could not be closed. Through that door came reform, royal supremacy, new laws of succession, and a different understanding of where authority lived. But the same doorway also admitted something darker: the idea that a queen could be not merely set aside, but destroyed, if her existence became inconvenient enough. For a while, Anne had seemed to be the answer to Henry's fear. Soon, she would become its next victim. The fall of Anne Boleyn did not begin with a single blow. It began with a change in atmosphere. That is often how danger moved in Henry's court. Not always as an announcement, not immediately as an arrest, but as a shift in who was invited closer, who was avoided, which smiles became thin, which conversations stopped when a particular person entered the room. A courtier could feel the weather turning before the storm had a name, and by the spring of 1536, the weather around Anne had become cold. The king's disappointment was no longer merely private. Anne had miscarried earlier that year, and the loss mattered far beyond grief. The details of Henry's reaction and Anne's exact words in those days are difficult to reconstruct with certainty. Later accounts carry their own motives and distortions, but the larger meaning is clear enough. Once again, the promise of a male heir had failed. Once again, Henry was left facing the possibility that he had rearranged the moral and political order of England for a marriage that could not give him what he most wanted. That failure did not make Anne guilty of anything. It made her vulnerable, and vulnerability, in Tudor politics, attracted knives. The accusations that emerged against Anne were astonishing: adultery, incest, treason. A queen was accused of sexual relationships with several men, including her own brother, George Boleyn. The charges were not just scandalous. They were constructed to make Anne's body a threat to the state. If the queen had been unfaithful, then the royal succession itself was contaminated. If she had imagined or discussed the king's death, as the accusation suggested, then desire had become treason. If her brother was involved, then the corruption reached into the blood of the family that had risen with her. It was a perfect set of charges for destroying a queen completely. That perfection is one reason historians continue to examine the case with suspicion. The evidence against Anne remains heavily disputed. Many scholars have argued that the accusations were exaggerated, manufactured, politically motivated, or built from fragments twisted into something lethal. Others have allowed for the possibility that careless speech, flirtatious courtly behavior, or factional hostility created material that could be weaponized. What is far harder to accept without caution is the full picture presented by the prosecution. A queen committing repeated adultery under the eyes of one of the most watched courts in Europe, with men whose movements and access could often be checked. This does not mean we can solve every detail. We cannot. The surviving record is partial, shaped by power, silence, fear, and later storytelling. Some documents are missing. Some accounts were written by people with interests of their own. Some of the most dramatic details come to us through channels that require careful handling. The legend has grown around the event like ivy around a broken wall, beautiful in places, but not the same thing as the stone beneath. What we can say with more confidence is that Anne's destruction happened with extraordinary speed. Men connected to her were arrested, Interrogations followed. One of them, Mark Smeaton, a musician in the royal household, confessed, though the conditions and reliability of that confession remain debated. Other accused men denied the charges. Sir Henry Norris, Sir Francis Weston, William Brereton, and George Boleyn were drawn into the case. Their alleged crimes did not simply damage them as individuals. They created a pattern around Anne, a courtly web that could be presented as moral chaos at the heart of the king's household. And then there was George. The accusation of incest between Anne and her brother was especially devastating. It pushed the story from adultery into monstrosity. It made the Boleyn family itself seem diseased by ambition and sin. Yet this is also one of the charges that demands the strongest caution. It served the prosecution too well. It turned political removal into moral annihilation. It ensured that pity for Anne would have to fight through disgust, disbelief, and fear. That was the function of the trial as much as its content. It did not merely ask whether Anne had sinned. It taught the court how to remember her. Here, Henry's presence is strangely powerful because it is often indirect. He did not need to stand in the courtroom shouting for blood. His will could be felt through the entire proceeding. Everyone understood whose marriage was being judged, whose honor had supposedly been violated, whose future was being cleared. In a monarchy like Henry's, legal process did not float above royal desire. It moved within its gravity. This is not to say that every person involved was pretending, or that Tudor law was theater in the simplest sense. The machinery had forms, offices, procedures, juries, oaths. Men could tell themselves they were doing lawful work. That is part of what makes the episode so chilling. Violence does not always appear as disorder. Sometimes it arrives properly dressed, with seals, titles, and careful language. Anne was taken to the Tower. The Tower was not only a prison. It was a place of royal ceremony, memory, fear, and contradiction. Queens had passed through it before coronations. Prisoners passed through it before death. Anne herself had once entered it in triumph before her crowning. Now she returned under accusation, and the symbolism needs no embellishment. The same institution that had staged her legitimacy now contained her ruin. Accounts of Anne in confinement vary, and here again caution is necessary. Some reports present her as frightened, emotional, talkative, even unstable under pressure. Others emphasize dignity, wit, or religious composure. It is possible that several of these impressions were true at different moments. A person facing death does not owe history a consistent performance. Fear, confusion, defiance, prayer, sarcasm, grief, all may have lived in the same room. What matters is that Anne was almost completely surrounded by interpretation. Her words could be recorded. Her moods could be reported. Her gestures could be made meaningful by people who already knew where the story was heading. The trials of the accused men came first. Convictions followed. Then Anne and George were tried before a court of peers. The outcome was never likely to surprise anyone who understood the direction of power. Both were found guilty. George Boleyn, along with the other condemned men, was executed. Anne's marriage to Henry was annulled, a final legal cruelty that made the whole affair even stranger. She was declared never to have been Henry's lawful wife, yet she was still condemned for betraying him as queen. That contradiction should stop us. If the marriage had not been valid, what exactly had she betrayed? The answer, in practical Tudor terms, was simple. She had betrayed the king because the king's need required that conclusion. Legal logic could bend. Theology could bend. Marriage could exist and not exist in whichever order was necessary to clear the path ahead. Anne was executed in May 1536. Henry granted, or arranged, for a swordsman from Calais to carry out the sentence rather than the more common axe. This detail is often repeated because it seems almost merciful, almost refined. But refinement should not distract from the fact itself. The Queen of England, the woman for whom Henry had broken with Rome and reshaped his kingdom, was put to death by the authority of the man who had once insisted she was his future. She died not as a private wife discarded quietly, but as a public warning. The men died with her. Her brother died with her. Her daughter Elizabeth, still a small child, was left in the wreckage, and Henry moved on with breathtaking speed. That speed is not a small detail. It changes how the whole episode feels. Within a short time, Jane Seymour stood beside him as the next queen-in-waiting, then as queen. The court adjusted, because courts survive by adjusting. Those who had honored Anne learned new language. Those who had feared her could breathe again. Those who had served her had to calculate whether any trace of loyalty might now be dangerous. The machinery did not mourn. It reset. This is why Anne Boleyn's trial remains one of the darkest chambers in Tudor history. Not because we can prove every secret behind it. We cannot. Not because Anne was perfect. She was human, political, ambitious, exposed, and capable of making enemies. But because the case shows how completely a person could be transformed once Henry no longer needed the version of them he had once loved. Anne had been the solution. Then she became the problem. And in Henry's England, a problem at the center of the royal family could be solved with law, accusation, ritual, and blood. The charges against her may never be settled beyond doubt. The evidence is too damaged, too shaped by power, too tangled in fear. But perhaps the deeper truth is not hidden in whether every allegation can be disproved. It is visible in the structure of the event itself. A queen failed to produce a son. A king needed release without humiliation. Enemies saw their opening. The law supplied a blade. And when it was over, the Tudor family was not safer in any human sense. It was only quieter, because the people left alive had learned what could happen when the king's disappointment required a verdict. Mary learned early that a royal childhood could be taken apart without anyone touching the child. No army had to enter her rooms. No public sentence had to be read over her cradle. No visible wound had to be left behind. Her world could be changed by documents, titles, household arrangements, the tone of a father's letter, the sudden caution of adults who had once spoken to her with warmth. For years, Mary had been Princess Mary. That title carried more than courtesy. It gave shape to the future around her. She had a household. She received an education suited to a royal daughter of great importance. Foreign marriages were discussed for her. Ambassadors studied her health and prospects. Her name belonged to the politics of Europe, not just the affections of her parents. Then Henry's marriage to Catherine was declared invalid, and Mary's certainty began to collapse. The cruelty of this was not only legal, it was emotional. And it was precise. If Catherine had never been Henry's lawful wife, then Mary's position as legitimate princess could be challenged. The child did not change. Her blood did not change. Her memory of being loved, honored, and addressed as royal, did not change. But the official meaning of her life changed around her. A person can survive that, but they do not survive it unchanged. Mary was not simply demoted in some abstract constitutional sense. She was pressured to accept the new reality Henry had created. She was expected to acknowledge that her mother was not the rightful queen, that Anne Boleyn was queen instead, and that her own title had been altered by the king's will. In effect, she was asked to participate in the undoing of her own childhood. That is a very particular kind of violence. Not the violence of a battlefield, but the violence of enforced agreement. The demand that a daughter look at her mother's humiliation and call it law. The demand that she accept her own displacement as obedience. The demand that conscience bow before survival. Mary resisted. Her resistance was not theatrical, in the way later stories sometimes prefer. It was not a rebellion with banners. It was the stubborn refusal of a young woman who believed her mother's marriage had been true and her own birth legitimate. That refusal made her dangerous, not because she commanded troops, but because she preserved an alternative version of reality inside the king's own family. Henry could tolerate many things badly. Contradiction inside his household was one of them. Once Elizabeth was born, the contrast became even sharper. The infant daughter of Anne Boleyn was now placed in the position Mary had once occupied. Elizabeth became the child around whom the new succession was arranged. Mary, older and fully aware of what was happening, was moved into a diminished place. At one point, she was even sent to serve in Elizabeth's household, a decision that carried a cold symbolic force. The former princess, daughter of Catherine of Aragon, was made subordinate within the world built for Anne Boleyn's child. It is worth pausing over that. This was not only administrative tidiness, it was a message. The old order would now wait on the new one. Mary's pride, grief, and loyalty to her mother were being disciplined through proximity to the child who had replaced her. Elizabeth, of course, was innocent. That is one of the quiet tragedies of the Tudor family. The children were made into rivals before they were old enough to understand the game. Mary had no reason, as a wounded daughter, to see Elizabeth merely as a baby. Elizabeth represented the marriage that had destroyed Catherine's security. She represented the legal argument that had damaged Mary's name. She represented Anne's triumph, Henry's will, and the new religious and political order pressing itself into daily life. Yet Elizabeth herself had chosen none of it. She was born into victory, and then victory vanished around her. After Anne Boleyn's fall, Elizabeth's position changed with frightening speed. Her mother was executed. Her parents' marriage was annulled. The child who had been proclaimed heir was now also declared illegitimate. The same legal imagination that had reduced Mary could now reduce Elizabeth. The same father who had once built a revolution around Anne could now erase the meaning of that marriage for the convenience of the next. In this, Mary and Elizabeth became unwilling mirrors of one another. Mary was damaged by the rise of Anne. Elizabeth was damaged by Anne's fall. Each girl's security depended not on stable affection, not on unbroken law, not even on simple blood, but on Henry's current version of the truth. Their identities became adjustable. Princess, lady, heir, bastard, restored, threatened, useful. These were not stages of inner growth. They were labels applied from above, according to the needs of the king and the politics surrounding him. The court understood this better than anyone. Servants, Tutors, relatives, and courtiers had to decide how much deference each girl deserved at any given moment. Too much respect for a demoted daughter could appear politically suspect. Too little respect could be dangerous if the king's mind changed again. Around Mary and Elizabeth, ordinary manners became calculations. A bow could carry meaning. A form of address could reveal allegiance. Even kindness had to be measured. This is the part of Henry's story that is sometimes overshadowed by the marriages themselves. The wives suffered openly, spectacularly, and in ways that history can more easily dramatize. Catherine pleading for the truth of her marriage, Anne walking to execution, Jane dying after childbirth, Catherine Howard facing the scaffold while still young enough to seem almost swallowed by the machinery around her. But the children suffered in a slower register. They had to keep living inside the consequences. Mary watched her mother degraded and separated from her, then endured years of pressure before eventually submitting to Henry's demands. That submission should not be mistaken for simple surrender of belief. It was survival. By the time she accepted the terms required of her, she had been pushed hard by power, isolation, and fear. To call it reconciliation would be too gentle. It was more like being forced to make peace with a locked door. Elizabeth's early wounds were different because she was younger. She could not remember Anne in the way Mary remembered Catherine. Her trauma was not built around defending a mother she had known intimately, but around growing up in the shadow of a mother whose name was dangerous. Anne Boleyn was both absence and stain, both origin and warning. For Elizabeth, the past had to be studied carefully. What could be said? What could not be said? Which loyalties were safe? Which memories might become fatal? No wonder both daughters became politically intelligent. They had to. Their education did not happen only in books, languages, music, theology, or courtly accomplishment. It happened in the unstable weather of Henry's favor. They learned that affection could be real and still unreliable. They learned that law could be solemn and still reversible. They learned that adults might speak warmly one day and withdraw the next, not necessarily from cruelty, but from fear. They learned that survival required self-command. This is where Henry's obsession with the succession produced one of its strangest results. In trying to secure the Tudor future, he trained his daughters in suspicion. Mary would grow into a queen shaped by loss, legitimacy, faith, and the memory of humiliation. Elizabeth would grow into a queen shaped by caution, performance, ambiguity, and the knowledge that marriage could be a trap as well as an alliance. Neither woman can be reduced to childhood injury, but neither can be understood without it. The court that wounded them also educated them in power. Henry wanted obedient heirs. He created survivors, and there is a difference. An obedient heir inherits smoothly, honors the father's design, continues the line as planned. A survivor inherits with scars. A survivor remembers the cost of trust. A survivor knows that the family can become a courtroom, that love can be made conditional, that legitimacy can depend on who controls the language of the state. Mary and Elizabeth were not raised in a normal royal household that happened to experience misfortune. They were raised inside a legal and emotional experiment conducted by their father's fear. Each time Henry tried to solve the succession, he destabilized the children already living within it. The future was protected in theory, while the actual heirs were made insecure in practice. This contradiction never fully left the Tudor story. A dynasty exists through children, but Henry treated his children's status as something he could damage and repair according to immediate need. He wanted heirs strong enough to carry England after him, yet he taught them that their place in the world could be revoked. He wanted certainty, but made uncertainty the atmosphere they breathed. And perhaps that is why the image of Mary and Elizabeth as girls is more haunting than any court execution. The scaffold is terrible, but it is final. Their punishment was to remain alive, watching the rules change. They had to wake each morning in a palace where their father was king, where their mother's fates shaped every conversation, and where their own names could be lifted or lowered by men writing in the language of law. Long before they wore crowns, Mary and Elizabeth learned what Henry's England truly was, a place where even a daughter had to earn the right to remain herself. By the time Edward was born, Henry's court had learned to speak in two languages at once. One was the language of celebration, heirs, blessings, obedience, order, the king's most noble purpose finally rewarded. It appeared in ceremonies, proclamations, sermons, and the careful smiles of men who knew the correct expression could be a form of self-defense. The other language was quieter. It was the language of survival. In that language, people asked different questions. Who was rising? Who was being watched? Which religious opinion was safe this month? Which friendship had become dangerous? Which word, once harmless, might now be repeated as evidence? A courtier did not need to be guilty to feel afraid. He only needed to understand that in Henry's England, guilt could sometimes be assembled after the decision had already been made. At the center of this new machinery stood Thomas Cromwell. Cromwell is one of those figures history finds difficult to leave in one shape. To some, he appears as the ruthless architect of royal terror, a man who could turn suspicion into paperwork and paperwork into death. To others, he is the hard, brilliant servant of a changing state, efficient, reform-minded, unsentimental, and frightening because he understood institutions better than the older nobility did. Both images catch something real, though neither is enough. He was not simply Henry's shadow. He was the man who helped give the shadow structure. Cromwell's rise itself tells us something about the changing nature of power. He was not a great hereditary magnate born into one of the ancient families that had long expected to advise kings as a matter of blood. His authority came from service, intelligence, usefulness, and his ability to make the king's will operate through systems. He could draft, investigate, coordinate, pressure, and remember. He understood that power did not always need a sword in its hand. Sometimes it needed a clerk. That may sound less dramatic. It was not less dangerous. Under Henry, especially after the break with Rome, the law became one of the crown's sharpest instruments. Oaths mattered, titles mattered, parliamentary acts mattered, definitions mattered. Treason, once focused more narrowly on threats against the king's person and realm, could be expanded in spirit and application until words, beliefs, and refusals became matters of mortal danger. To deny the king's supremacy over the church was not merely a theological disagreement. It could be treated as disobedience to the crown itself. This was a profound change in the atmosphere of English life. The old medieval world had certainly known brutality. No one should imagine that pre-Tudor politics was gentle, but Henry's reign developed a particularly chilling combination: personal monarchy, religious upheaval, legal innovation, bureaucratic reach, and a court trained to anticipate the king's emotional weather. The result was not random chaos. Random chaos is terrifying in one way. Henry's system was terrifying in another because it could make terror look orderly. Men were not merely dragged away in the night and forgotten. They were examined, charged, indicted, tried, condemned, recorded. The state kept receipts for its violence. That is the unsettling modern note in Cromwell's world. We are not looking only at a king losing his temper. We are looking at the creation of procedures capable of translating royal anxiety into official fact. A rumor could become an inquiry. An inquiry could become testimony. Testimony could become treason. Treason could become a scaffold. And afterward, the documents could suggest that everything had happened properly. This is where Henry's destruction of family becomes more than emotional. It becomes administrative. The same methods used to settle royal marriage could be used to discipline the kingdom. The same impulse that had reduced Catherine from wife to legal problem, Mary from princess to illegitimate daughter, Anne from queen to traitor, could reach outward into monasteries, noble households, court factions, and religious communities. People were categorized according to obedience. Their words were weighed. Their loyalties were interpreted. Their property, in some cases, became very interesting to the crown. Cromwell's role in the dissolution of the monasteries belongs to the wider story of religious and political transformation. But it also belongs to the emotional history of Henry's reign. Monasteries were not only religious houses, they were landholders, employers, centers of charity, memory, education, and local identity. Their destruction transferred wealth and power, but it also sent a message. Institutions older than the Tudor dynasty itself could be inspected, judged, stripped, and closed if they stood on the wrong side of royal policy. If monasteries could fall, who was secure? If queens could fall, who was safe? The answer, increasingly, was no one whose safety depended on yesterday's favor. Cromwell's investigations into religious houses, his use of commissioners, his management of parliamentary change, and his ability to turn scattered royal aims into enforceable policy made him indispensable. But indispensability in Henry's court was never the same as safety. It could even become the opposite. The more useful a minister became, the more visible he was. The more visible he was, the more enemies he gathered. And the more he tied himself to the king's will, the more completely he could be blamed when that will shifted. For a while, Cromwell mastered the court of survival better than almost anyone. He knew how to move through files, alliances, patronage, and fear. He helped raise some men and ruin others. He became a channel through which petitions, accusations, reforms, ambitions, and resentments passed. His enemies saw him as low-born arrogance made flesh, a man who had climbed too high by serving the king's most disruptive appetites. His allies saw a statesman capable of dragging England into a new political age. Henry likely saw something simpler, a tool that worked. That was both Cromwell's strength and his danger. A king who treats people as instruments will eventually test whether the instrument still pleases him. Cromwell could survive moral outrage, aristocratic disdain, and religious controversy as long as Henry needed his skill. But need is not gratitude. Henry's loyalty to servants was conditional, especially when his pride, marriage, or succession became involved. The machinery Cromwell helped build did not belong to Cromwell. It belonged to the king. And that meant it could one day turn back on its builder. This is a recurring pattern in Henry's reign. The people closest to the center often believed, or had to behave as if they believed, that they could manage the danger. Wolsey before Cromwell had served Henry's ambitions and fallen when he failed to deliver the annulment. Anne had risen through the king's desire and fallen when desire turned into disappointment. Cromwell would learn the same lesson in another form. To serve Henry was to stand near a furnace and call the heat favor. There is a temptation to imagine Henry as merely manipulated by clever ministers, as though Cromwell and others created the hard edges of the reign while the king floated above them. That is too convenient. Ministers shaped methods, supplied arguments, and often pursued their own agendas. But Henry was not a passive figure. He understood enough to choose, approve, reward, punish, and reverse. His servants could build the machine, but the king supplied its authority. The terror of the court came from that partnership between personality and process. Henry's moods alone could not have remade England. Cromwell's paperwork alone could not have done it either. Together, royal will and administrative genius created something far more durable than anger. A system in which obedience could be demanded in writing, enforced by oath, and punished by law. For the royal family, this meant there was almost no refuge from politics. A daughter's title could be altered by statute. A queen's past could be investigated by commission. A marriage could be invalidated through legal reasoning. A relative's bloodline could be examined for threat. Family was no longer protected by intimacy. It was exposed by proximity. The nearer someone stood to the throne, the more carefully the machinery could see them. And Cromwell, more than any other servant of Henry's middle reign, helped sharpen that sight. He did not invent the king's fear. He organized it. He did not create Henry's hunger for certainty. He gave it channels. He did not personally destroy every life caught in the machinery, but he helped build the kind of government in which destruction could be scheduled, justified, and filed. That is why the court of Henry VIII feels so claustrophobic. It was not only that people feared the king's rage, they feared the next document, the next oath, the next interview behind a closed door, the next question that sounded harmless until a secretary wrote it down. In such a world, innocence was not always enough. Privacy was thinner than it appeared. Loyalty had to be constantly performed, and performance could exhaust even the strongest. By the late 1530s, Henry had his son, his supremacy, and a government increasingly able to enforce his will. On paper, the dynasty looked stronger than it had in years. The old marriage crisis had been resolved. The male heir had been born. Opposition had been punished. The church in England had been brought under royal authority. But the price of this strength was a court that had learned to live without trust. Everyone had seen too much. They had seen Catherine's dignity fail to save her position. They had seen Anne's crown fail to save her life. They had seen Mary and Elizabeth reduced by law. They had seen religious houses collapse. They had seen famous men fall. They had seen that service did not guarantee mercy. Cromwell's machine made Henry more powerful. It did not make him less afraid. And that distinction would matter, because a king who has gained the machinery of control may begin to use it not only against his enemies, but against the very people who proved how well it worked. The marriage to Anne of Cleves began not with desire, but with a portrait. That detail has always given the story a faintly theatrical quality, as if a king accustomed to commanding armies, churches, marriages, and deaths somehow found himself defeated by paint. It is tempting to treat the whole episode as comedy. Henry, aging and irritable, sees an image he likes, agrees to marry the woman, then recoils when reality refuses to flatter him. There is humor in it, perhaps, but it is a dangerous kind, because by 1540, nothing around Henry stayed harmless for long. Jane Seymour was dead. Edward lived, but he was still a child. England's religious settlement remained tense, watched anxiously by both reformers and conservatives. Abroad, the Catholic powers of Europe could appear threatening when their interests aligned. Henry's ministers had to think not only about the king's bedchamber, but about alliances, enemies, trade, war, and the possibility that England might need friends on the continent. Anne of Cleves entered through that world of calculation. She was the sister of Duke William of Cleves, whose territories made him politically useful in the shifting religious and diplomatic landscape of Europe. The match was not built primarily on romance. It was meant to strengthen England's position and connect Henry with a Protestant-leaning alliance at a time when international danger seemed plausible. Cromwell, who favored the marriage, saw in Anne a diplomatic answer to a diplomatic problem. Henry, however, was not a diplomatic problem. He was a man who expected politics to satisfy his pride. The famous portrait by Hans Holbein has carried much of the blame in popular memory. Later accounts suggest that Henry felt misled by Anne's appearance, and Holbein's image became part of the legend. The painter who made a bride too beautiful, the king who married a picture and discovered a woman. But we should be careful. Portraits in royal marriage negotiations were never neutral snapshots. They were instruments of presentation. They suggested status, health, poise, suitability. They flattered, but within understood conventions. The evidence about Anne's appearance is tangled, and much of what survives is filtered through Henry's disappointment after the fact. Once the king rejected her, it became useful for others to agree that rejection had been reasonable. A court that had learned to survive by adjusting its memory could hardly be expected to defend the face of an unwanted queen. What we can say is simpler and more revealing. Henry did not like her, and when Henry did not like something, the kingdom often had to discover a legal reason why. Their first meeting went badly. Henry, perhaps expecting a romantic moment shaped by chivalric fantasy, approached Anne in disguise. The gesture belonged to an older, courtly tradition. The king as gallant stranger, the lady recognizing nobility beneath costume. But Anne did not respond as Henry wished. She may not have understood the game. She may have been startled, confused, or simply unfamiliar with the particular performance he expected. It was a small failure of theater. Henry experienced it as humiliation. This is one of the most human and revealing moments in the entire reign. Not grand theology, not treason law, not dynastic theory. A man playing at romance is not recognized in the way he imagined, and the embarrassment curdles into rejection. For an ordinary man, this might have meant wounded vanity. For Henry, it became a matter of state. By then, Henry was no longer the golden prince of his youth. He was older, heavier, physically troubled, and likely in chronic pain. The gap between how he wished to be seen and how he was actually seen had widened. Anne's failure was not simply that she did not please him. She may have accidentally made him feel visible. That was unforgivable. The marriage went ahead, but Henry quickly wanted out. He complained that Anne was unattractive to him, that he could not consummate the marriage, and that there were questions around her earlier betrothal to the Duke of Lorraine's son. Once again, intimate failure was translated into legal material. Once again, the language of marriage law offered a path away from emotional discomfort. Once again, a woman's position depended on the king's need to escape without losing face. But Anne of Cleves survived because she understood, or was advised to understand, the essential rule. Do not resist Henry when resistance can only feed the danger. Unlike Catherine of Aragon, Anne did not insist on the full validity of her marriage. Unlike Anne Boleyn, she was not surrounded by charges of sexual treason. She accepted the annulment. She agreed to the king's terms. In return, she received a generous settlement and the title of the king's beloved sister. It was a peculiar afterlife for a queen, demoted but honored, rejected but enriched, removed from the marriage bed but allowed to live in comfort. Her survival was not evidence that Henry had become merciful. It was evidence that she had made herself non-threatening. Anne of Cleves had no child whose legitimacy needed defending. She had no powerful emotional history with Henry to contest. She had not become the center of a domestic faction in the way Anne Boleyn had. Most importantly, she did not force the king to argue with her. She allowed him the story he needed, that the marriage had been a mistake, that he had been misled, that no true union existed, that all could be undone with minimal injury to royal dignity. In Henry's court, surrender could be a form of genius. Cromwell was not so fortunate. The failure of the Cleves marriage gave his enemies an opening they had been waiting for. Conservative figures at court disliked his religious policies, resented his influence, and distrusted his rise. Aristocratic opponents saw in him the same thing they had always seen: a man of low birth who had climbed too close to the king by mastering the unpleasant arts of government. The marriage made him vulnerable because it touched Henry's pride in the most intimate way. Cromwell had not merely arranged a bad alliance. He had made the king feel ridiculous. That was more dangerous than policy failure. The same minister who had helped make and unmake queens now found the machinery turning toward him. He was arrested in June 1540. The accusations against him were broad and severe: treason, heresy, corruption, and other charges designed to make his fall seem not like a political reversal, but a necessary cleansing of the realm. As with so many Tudor destructions, the charges gathered different kinds of hostility into one fatal package. Religious suspicion, personal resentment, factional revenge, and royal anger could all be bound together beneath the word treason. Cromwell tried to plead for mercy. Henry did not give enough of it to save him. He was executed in July 1540, on the same day Henry married Catherine Howard. The timing is almost too sharp for fiction, which is usually a sign that history has been edited by power rather than imagination. One minister dies. One young queen rises. The court turns a page while the ink is still wet, and Henry keeps moving. Cromwell's fall exposes a central rule of the reign. Usefulness had an expiration date. It did not matter that Cromwell had helped secure royal supremacy. It did not matter that he had guided legislation, managed reforms, enriched the crown, and served the king's will with remarkable energy. When he failed in a matter that touched Henry's pride and marriage, his past service became less a shield than a record of dangerous power. A servant who had done so much could be made to answer for almost anything. This is why the Anne of Cleves episode should not be treated only as the funny marriage, the awkward portrait, the harmless annulment. It is one of the clearest demonstrations of how unstable Henry's court had become. A foreign princess survived by yielding completely. The king's chief minister died because the king's dissatisfaction needed a body to absorb it. And the body could not be Anne's. It had to be Cromwell's. Anne's later life in England was, by Tudor standards, almost astonishingly peaceful. She remained in the country, maintained status, and outlived Henry and his other wives. Her decision not to fight gave her a future. Whether she felt humiliation, relief, fear, or all three, we cannot know with certainty. But from the outside, her story contains a bleak lesson. In Henry's family, the safest wife was the one who stopped being a wife before the king had to hate her. Cromwell's story contains the companion lesson. The man who builds the king's exit door may one day be pushed through it. By 1540, Henry had become a ruler whose emotional injuries could reorder political life with terrifying speed. The machinery was still there. Councils, acts, charges, interrogations, formal judgments. But beneath the process was an aging king who could not bear frustration, especially when it made him look weak, foolish, or dependent on another man's judgment. Anne of Cleves revealed that Henry's search for dynasty had become inseparable from his hunger for control over his own image. He wanted a wife who pleased him. He wanted a minister who never failed him. He wanted a court that confirmed his version of events before he fully finished speaking. Anne survived by agreeing. Cromwell died because agreement was no longer enough. And as the court adjusted again, as it always did, because survival required motion, Henry turned toward a younger woman, a brighter distraction, and a disaster that would bring the scaffold back into the royal marriage bed. Catherine Howard entered the story at the very moment Thomas Cromwell left it. That timing matters. It makes her arrival feel almost like a change in music at court. The hard administrative rhythm of Cromwell's England giving way to something lighter, younger, more decorative, and dangerously flattering to an aging king. Henry had just escaped the embarrassment of Anne of Cleves. He had punished the minister associated with that failure. Now he wanted renewal, not in policy, not in theology, not in the solemn language of succession, but in the mirror of a young woman's attention. Catherine Howard was young. Exactly how young remains debated, because her birth date is not known with certainty. But she was certainly much younger than Henry, and that difference is not a side detail. It sits at the center of the tragedy. The story that followed has often been told as a scandal of lust and betrayal, with Catherine cast as foolish, reckless, or corrupt. Yet that version gives too much clarity to a life shaped by youth, limited protection, family ambition, and a court that could turn private vulnerability into public destruction. She was a Howard, connected to one of the great noble families of England. That blood gave her access, but not safety. The Howards had reasons to welcome her rise. A queen from their family meant influence near the king, especially after Cromwell's fall had weakened the reformist faction associated with him. Catherine's elevation was therefore not simply a romance between an old king and a young woman. It was also a political event, one that shifted the balance of court power. Henry adored her, or at least adored what he believed she represented. Youth, freshness, submission, a restoration of masculine confidence after the humiliation of Cleves. In Catherine, Henry could imagine himself desired again. That was no small thing. By this stage, he was physically declining, troubled by pain and illness, far removed from the dazzling prince who once embodied Tudor promise. Catherine's presence allowed the court to perform a comforting fiction, that the king was still vigorous, still romantic, still capable of inspiring devotion rather than fear. Courts are skilled at such fictions. They smile them into existence. They arrange rooms around them. They make everyone participate. But Catherine had a past, and in Henry's court, a queen's past could become lethal. Before her marriage, Catherine had spent time in the household of the Dowager Duchess of Norfolk, where discipline appears to have been loose and supervision uneven. Later investigations would focus on her relationships before she became queen, especially with Henry Manox and Francis Derham. The details are difficult, and they must be handled carefully. Some accounts suggest sexual misconduct, pressure, youthful experimentation, exploitation, or promises of marriage. The evidence is not always clean enough to support the neat moral story later built around her. What we can say is that Catherine had not lived the untouched, carefully guarded life expected of a queen. And once she became Henry's wife, that mattered terribly. The first danger lay in the mismatch between image and reality. Henry had married Catherine as a symbol of purity and renewal. He called her his rose without a thorn, a phrase that has followed her through history with cruel irony. Whether he meant it as courtly praise or emotional self-deception, the image created a trap. Catherine did not merely have to be loyal. She had to preserve Henry's fantasy of her. A woman can fail a husband. A queen can fail a dynasty. But Catherine's real danger was that she might make Henry feel deceived. Again. The investigation began after information about her earlier life reached men in power. Archbishop Thomas Cranmer became involved, and the matter was brought toward the king with caution. This was not a small accusation. To tell Henry that his young queen had a compromising past was to approach a furnace carrying dry paper. The news did not simply concern Catherine. It touched the king's honor, judgment, body, and public image. Henry's first reaction, by some accounts, was disbelief. That detail is painful because it suggests how deeply he needed Catherine's innocence to remain true. He had invested in her as a kind of emotional correction. After Catherine of Aragon's resistance, Anne Boleyn's fall, Jane Seymour's death, and Anne of Cleves' rejection, Catherine Howard gave him the feeling of uncomplicated devotion. To question her was to question the story Henry was telling himself about his own restored desirability. But the evidence gathered. Catherine's past with Derham became especially dangerous because of the possibility that there had been a pre-contract, a binding promise that could have made her marriage to Henry invalid. Once again, the private history of a woman was dragged into legal examination. Once again, marriage law became a blade. But the case did not remain confined to the past. The more fatal allegation involved Thomas Culpeper, a gentleman of the king's privy chamber. Culpeper had access to Henry's intimate circle. He was not some distant figure from Catherine's earlier life. Alleged meetings between Catherine and Culpeper after her marriage raised the stakes from premarital scandal to possible adultery. If the queen had pursued or permitted an improper relationship while married to the king, the matter became not only sexual betrayal, but treasonous danger. In Tudor logic, the queen's body was tied to succession, legitimacy, and royal honor. Her suspected desire could be treated as a threat to the realm. Here again, certainty is difficult. The surviving evidence shows secret contact, dangerous behavior, and testimony that placed Catherine in grave peril. But the exact nature of her relationship with Culpeper remains disputed. Some later retellings turn it into a passionate affair. Others emphasize intention rather than completed adultery. The evidence is thinner in the most intimate places, precisely where the story has most often been made lurid. We should resist the easy version. Catherine Howard was not simply a foolish girl chasing romance under the nose of a king. She was a young queen in a court where men around her had power, motives, and access. Culpeper himself was not an innocent decoration. Dereham was not merely a name from the past. Lady Rochford, Jane Boleyn, who had once been connected to the fall of Anne Boleyn and George Boleyn, became entangled in Catherine's secret meetings. The whole case is full of people whose choices are difficult to separate from pressure, ambition, fear, and self-preservation. And at the center was Catherine, trying far too late to survive a system she may never have fully understood. That is not to say she made no choices. She did. But the moral scale often used against her has been too simple. We are looking at a young woman raised in conditions that did not prepare her safely for queenship, lifted suddenly into the most exposed female position in England, married to a dangerous old king, and surrounded by factions that benefited from her beauty until her secrets became more useful than her favor. Once the king turned against her, protection vanished. Culpeper and Dereham were executed. Their deaths helped frame Catherine's story as treason, lust, and betrayal. Catherine herself was stripped of the role Henry had given her. She was no longer the rose without a thorn. She became the proof that the king had been deceived, and that deception required punishment. The law moved with terrible efficiency. In Catherine's case, Parliament passed an act making it treason for an unchaste woman to marry the king without disclosing her past, and also condemning Catherine and Lady Rochford. This legal development shows the strange backward motion of Henry's justice. When ordinary law did not quite fit the king's humiliation, the law could be reshaped until it did. The realm was again instructed to treat Henry's private injury as a matter of national danger. Catherine was executed in February 1542. She was not the first queen Henry destroyed, but her death felt different from Anne Boleyn's. Anne had been a political figure of extraordinary force, surrounded by religious conflict, factional struggle, and the explosive consequences of the break with Rome. Catherine Howard's tragedy is smaller in one sense and more pitiful in another. She did not change England. She did not drive a religious revolution. She did not stand at the center of a constitutional crisis. She became dangerous because she embarrassed the king. That may sound too blunt, but it is hard to avoid. The charges were grave in Tudor terms. The implications for royal honor were serious. Yet beneath the structure of law and treason lay Henry's wounded pride. Catherine had allowed him to believe in a story of rejuvenation. When that story broke, someone had to pay for the shame of its breaking. A young woman paid with her life. Lady Rochford died with her, after a collapse of mind or spirit that the sources describe in ways we should treat cautiously. She had lived through the earlier catastrophe of Anne Boleyn's fall, and now she was consumed by another queen's ruin. Her presence gives Catherine Howard's story a grim echo, as if the court itself were recycling its traumas through new bodies and old methods. The scaffold returned, but it did not return as surprise. That may be the darkest sign of all. By 1542, the execution of a queen was no longer unimaginable. Henry had already crossed that boundary. The court knew the path from accusation to confinement, from confession to condemnation, from royal love to public death. Catherine's fall did not invent a new kind of terror. It confirmed that the previous terror had become available for use again. The first time, the kingdom was shocked. The second time, it understood the procedure. Catherine Howard's life has too often been reduced to the question of guilt. Was she unfaithful? Was she reckless? Was she abused? Was she manipulated? Was she a victim of her own past or of the ambitions of others? The honest answer is not simple. The evidence supports danger, secrecy, and conduct that could be fatal in her world. It also reveals a young woman trapped inside a court far more experienced in destruction than she was in survival. What remains most telling is Henry's pattern. He did not protect the women who reflected badly on him. Catherine of Aragon made him feel spiritually trapped. Anne Boleyn made him feel dynastically cheated. Anne of Cleves made him feel ridiculous. Catherine Howard made him feel deceived. Each woman was different. Each case had its own legal and political form. But Henry's response followed the same cold instinct. The woman must be redefined so the king could remain central, righteous, and wronged. Catherine Howard was not a great architect of history. She was one of history's casualties. Her fall shows what Henry's court could do to someone who entered it young, useful, and unprepared. It could praise her as purity, use her as factional victory, display her as proof of the king's renewed power, investigate her as contamination, condemn her as treason, and erase her almost before she had finished becoming an adult. And after she died, the court continued. That may be the most haunting part. The machinery did not break beneath the weight of another queen's execution. The palace did not become uninhabitable. Servants still served, counselors still met, musicians still played when required. The king still needed attendance, meals, documents, and deference. Life resumed around the absence, but everyone who remained knew the truth Catherine's death had made plain. Near Henry, youth was not protection. Beauty was not protection. Noble blood was not protection. Even being loved by the king was not protection, because love in Henry's court was only safe while it protected his image of himself. Henry's marriages made the danger visible, but the bloodline around him made it wider. To stand near the Tudor throne was to live inside a strange arithmetic. Blood could elevate you. Blood could protect you. Blood could make your name valuable in marriage negotiations, your presence welcome at ceremonies, your loyalty useful to the crown. But the same blood could also turn against you. A royal connection was not a shield if it suggested an alternative future. It could become a mark, a quiet accusation carried in the body. This was one of the darker legacies of the Wars of the Roses. The Tudors had come to power by defeating one dynastic claim and absorbing others through marriage, symbolism, and force. Henry VII had married Elizabeth of York, joining the red rose and the white in the image his dynasty wanted England to remember. But symbols do not erase all rival memories. They only cover them neatly enough for ceremony. Behind the Tudor story remained older bloodlines: Yorkist blood, Plantagenet blood. Families whose names still carried a dangerous echo. For Henry VIII, these people were not always active enemies. Many served the crown. Many likely wished only to survive in dignity. Some were elderly. Some were children. Some were far less politically dangerous in reality than they appeared inside the king's imagination. But monarchy does not fear only what is probable. It fears what might be useful to someone else. A rival does not need to plot in order to become dangerous. Others may plot around them. That is the logic that made royal kinship so perilous. A person with a claim, however distant, could become a banner. They might not seek rebellion. They might not desire the crown. They might not even have the temperament for politics. But if enough dissatisfied men could point to their blood and say, "There is another way," then their existence had meaning beyond their intentions. Henry understood this, perhaps too well. The case of Margaret Pole shows the terror of that logic with particular force. Margaret was not some obscure conspirator creeping through the edges of Tudor life. She was a great noblewoman, Countess of Salisbury, and one of the last prominent figures connected by blood to the old Plantagenet line. She was the daughter of George, Duke of Clarence, brother of Edward IV and Richard III. In another age, under another arrangement of death and victory, her family might have stood much closer to the crown. That heritage made her important. It also made her unsafe. For a time, Margaret Pole enjoyed favor. She served within the royal household and had a significant role in Princess Mary's life. That connection to Mary matters because Mary herself had become the living center of resistance to Henry's new marital and religious order. Margaret's Catholic loyalty, her noble status, her closeness to Catherine of Aragon's daughter, and her Plantagenet descent formed a pattern that could be read, or made to be read, as threat. But the story becomes even more dangerous through her son, Reginald Pole. Reginald became a fierce critic of Henry's break with Rome. From abroad, he condemned the king's religious policies and challenged the legitimacy of his supremacy over the English church. In Henry's world, a son's defiance could stain the mother. Family did not only transmit honor, it transmitted suspicion. That was one of the cruel structures of the reign. Punishment could move sideways through blood. Reginald was beyond Henry's easy reach, but his family in England was not. Members of the Pole family were drawn into accusations of treason. Henry Courtenay, Marquis of Exeter, another figure with royal blood, was also destroyed during the wider crackdown on perceived dynastic threats. The details of these cases involve real political anxiety, religious opposition, and the possibility of conspiracy, but they also show how elastic the idea of danger had become. The crown did not need every suspect to be a mastermind. It needed them to be plausible enough. Margaret Pole was arrested and imprisoned. The evidence against her was contested and deeply troubling. One famous item connected to the case was a tunic or emblem supposedly bearing symbols linked to Catholic or royalist resistance. But historians have treated aspects of this evidence with caution. What matters for our story is not that Margaret can be easily proven innocent in every possible political sense, nor that Henry's fears came from nowhere. It is that the machinery of suspicion could absorb an elderly woman of royal blood and transform her lineage into a threat that required elimination. She was executed in 1541. Her death has often been remembered as especially brutal, though some later accounts of the exact scene may have grown in the telling. The safest thing to say is grim enough. An elderly noblewoman, once close to the royal family, was killed by order of the Tudor state because her blood, her connections, and her family's opposition had become intolerable to the king. That is not a side story. It is Henry's family policy taken beyond the marriage bed, The wives reveal how Henry treated women who failed, resisted, embarrassed, or threatened him within marriage. The children reveal how he could damage those he claimed to be protecting. But the wider kin reveal something else. That Henry's obsession with succession did not stop at producing an heir. It also required clearing the horizon of alternative heirs. A dynasty is not secured only by birth. It is secured by removing the people who might make birth seem insufficient. This is where the Tudor court begins to resemble a map marked with invisible lines of danger. Not every noble was equally exposed. Not every old family was doomed. But some names carried too much history. A cousin with royal descent might be honored at one moment and watched at another. A family marriage could be useful until the political weather changed. A blood connection that once helped legitimize the Tudors could later remind everyone that Tudor legitimacy had not always been unquestioned. Henry's fear was not irrational in the broadest historical sense. England had suffered from contested succession. Pretenders and rival claims had troubled his father's reign. Noble factions could be opportunistic. Foreign powers could exploit internal division. Religion, by the 1530s and 1540s, added another layer of danger. A Catholic claimant, or even a Catholic noble with Plantagenet descent, could become meaningful to those who rejected Henry's supremacy. So Henry's court did what fearful regimes often do. It treated possibility as evidence. It treated ancestry as intent. It treated proximity as guilt waiting to be discovered. The tragedy is that this method could never fully satisfy the fear that created it. There is always another cousin, another marriage connection, another child born to another branch, another old title carried by someone who did not ask to inherit the past. Bloodlines are not easily erased because they live in memory as much as in bodies. A king can execute a person, but the fact of descent has already existed. The fear simply moves. Henry's own family history made this worse. He knew that his dynasty's claim had been assembled from victory, marriage, and narrative. The Tudors were legitimate kings, but they were also careful storytellers about legitimacy. They needed people to believe that the wars were over, that the red and white roses had been reconciled, that the crown had found its rightful line. Anyone whose blood suggested an older story had to be managed. Some could be managed with favor, some with marriage, some with office, some with imprisonment, some with death. Margaret Pole's fall is therefore not an isolated cruelty. It belongs to the same emotional architecture as Henry's treatment of Catherine, Mary, Anne, Elizabeth, and Catherine Howard. In each case, a person close to the royal center became dangerous because of what they represented. Catherine represented a marriage Henry needed invalidated. Mary represented a legitimacy he needed to control. Anne represented a promise that failed, and a wife whose removal required moral annihilation. Elizabeth represented the child of that unstable promise. Catherine Howard represented the humiliation of deception. Margaret Pole represented another kind of threat, the past that refused to remain dead. And the past was especially dangerous because it could be inherited. This is why noble families in Henry's reign had to think not only about what they did, but about what their grandparents had been. A careless conversation could matter. A marriage alliance could matter. A coat of arms, a household connection, a rumor carried through the court. All could be fitted into a pattern if the crown wanted to see one. The court had become expert at pattern making. That is a dangerous expertise. Once power begins searching for treason, it often finds shapes that confirm its need. A letter becomes suspicious because the writer's cousin is suspicious. A devotional loyalty becomes political because the old religion is now a challenge to the king. A family name becomes a signal. A silence becomes a possible refusal. The evidence may be real in pieces, but the conclusion is assembled inside fear. Henry did not kill every relative with acclaim. He did not purge the entire nobility. His reign was not a single, unbroken massacre. Accuracy requires that we resist turning him into a figure of pure theatrical evil. His government had genuine concerns. Some opposition was real. Some people did conspire. Some of the threats around the succession and religion were not imaginary. But the pattern remains chilling because Henry's response so often exceeded the human scale of the danger. The crown's need for certainty became a permission to destroy, and certainty, once demanded absolutely, becomes impossible to satisfy. If the king fears rival blood, then no oath can fully cleanse it. If he fears religious dissent, then no outward obedience feels fully reliable. If he fears the collapse of succession, then every alternative lineage looks like a door through which chaos might return. So the palace watched not only queens and ministers, but cousins. It watched old women with dangerous ancestors. It watched young nobles with names too close to the throne. It watched families whose loyalty might be sincere, but whose lineage made sincerity insufficient. Margaret Pole's execution stands as a particularly cold reminder that Henry's family was not limited to the women he married and the children he fathered. His family was also the wider web of royal blood that surrounded him. The cousins, descendants, heirs, and claimants who made the Tudor story less simple than Tudor propaganda wished. To Henry, these people could appear as cracks in the wall. To us, they look more like evidence of the fear behind the wall. Because a truly secure dynasty does not need to tremble at every echo of another name. A confident king does not need to read treason into ancestry so often. Henry's violence toward his kin reveals the very fragility he spent his life trying to deny. He wanted the Tudor line to seem inevitable, but the more he punished those who reminded him it was not, the more he exposed the anxiety at the heart of the throne. Catherine Parr came to Henry after the court had learned what queenship could cost. By then, no woman could approach the king's hand without seeing the ghosts around it. Catherine of Aragon had been set aside. Anne Boleyn had been executed. Jane Seymour had died after giving him a son. Anne of Cleves had survived by accepting removal. Catherine Howard had gone to the scaffold while still painfully young. These were not rumors from a distant age. They were recent memories, carried by the people still serving, watching, advising, and surviving. So when Catherine Parr became Henry's sixth wife, she entered not a romance, but a hazardous institution. She was not a girl dazzled by sudden elevation. She had been married before. She had experience of households, property, illness, duty, and the careful management of men's expectations. This mattered. Catherine Parr's intelligence was not only the intelligence of books, though she was learned and religiously engaged. It was also practical intelligence. The ability to read a room, to sense danger in a conversation, to know when conviction should speak and when it should lower its voice. Near Henry, that kind of intelligence could save a life. Her marriage to the king in 1543 came during his final years, when his body was failing and his temper had not softened into harmlessness. Henry was ill, often in pain, and increasingly difficult to manage. Physical decline did not make him less powerful. In some ways, it may have made the court more anxious, because a suffering king remained a king, and every discomfort around him could become someone else's danger. Catherine Parr's role was therefore delicate from the beginning. She was wife, nurse, companion, queen, stepmother, religious patron, and political actor, though each role had to be performed with care. She could not simply be affectionate. She had to be useful. She could not simply be learned. She had to be learned in a way that did not appear to instruct the king too boldly. She could not simply hold religious opinions. She had to hold them in a court where religious opinion could become evidence. That last danger was especially sharp. Catherine Parr had reformist sympathies. She was interested in religious writing, scripture, and devotional thought. She would become the first Queen of England to publish under her own name. But in Henry's reign, religious thought was not a private hobby. It was political material. The king had broken with Rome, but he was not a simple Protestant reformer in the later sense. He could reject papal authority while still defending traditional doctrines. Around him stood factions eager to push reform forward or pull it back. Catherine's mind made her valuable. It also made her vulnerable. This is one of the most revealing contradictions of her queenship. Henry seems to have appreciated her intelligence and seriousness, at least for a time. He trusted her enough to appoint her regent in 1544 while he campaigned in France, an important sign of confidence. She managed the role with competence, and it echoed in a quieter way the earlier authority Catherine of Aragon had held decades before. Henry could respect capable women when their capability served his kingship, but respect was never a guarantee of safety. Catherine also helped repair something Henry himself had damaged: the shape of the royal family. She encouraged a warmer household around Mary, Elizabeth, and Edward. She supported the education of the children. She helped bring Henry's daughters closer to courtly recognition again, not by undoing the past, because that was beyond her power, but by helping create conditions in which they could stand nearer to the center without immediate humiliation. This was not sentimental housekeeping. It was dynastic work. The Tudor family had been fractured by law, marriage, execution, and suspicion. Mary and Elizabeth had both been declared illegitimate at different points. Edward, the precious son, had grown in a world where his sister's status was politically useful but emotionally unstable. Catherine Parr helped gather these children into a more coherent royal image. She did not heal everything. No one could. But she understood that a dynasty is not made only by statutes and births. It is also made by the daily rituals of recognition. Who is invited? Who is educated? Who is addressed with care? Who is allowed to belong? Henry, after all his damage, still needed the appearance of a family. Catherine helped provide it. There is a quiet power in that. It lacks the violence of Anne Boleyn's fall or the drama of Catherine of Aragon's resistance, but it matters deeply. Catherine Parr's great political talent may have been her ability to make stability look domestic. She created a space in which the royal children could be seen together, cultivated, and prepared for the future. In doing so, she helped preserve the very succession Henry had repeatedly endangered. Yet even Catherine's carefulness nearly failed her. Toward the end of Henry's life, conservative enemies at court became alarmed by her religious leanings and her discussions with the king. The story, in its broad outline, is familiar. Catherine debated theology with Henry, perhaps too boldly. Opponents saw an opening. An arrest warrant was prepared, and Catherine survived only by humbling herself before the king, presenting her arguments as a wife's attempt to learn from his superior wisdom rather than to challenge him. Some details of the episode come through accounts shaped after the fact, so the scene should not be treated as if every word were preserved perfectly. But the larger meaning is credible and chilling. Catherine Parr, the careful queen, the learned queen, the queen who had helped restore family order, came close enough to danger that she had to save herself through performance. Not innocence. Performance. She recognized what Henry needed in that moment. Not a rival mind, not a debating partner who might expose his weakness, but a wife who confirmed his mastery. So she retreated without appearing cowardly. She made submission into strategy. She turned conversation back into obedience. And when the officers came, according to the traditional account, Henry rebuked them. The queen had survived, but survival under Henry always reveals the danger it escaped. Catherine Parr's near fall tells us that even the last queen, the one often remembered as sensible, mature, and safe, was never truly beyond reach. Her usefulness, kindness, and intelligence did not protect her automatically. She had to manage the king's pride with almost surgical precision. She had to know when to be visible and when to disappear behind deference. She had to let Henry feel wiser, stronger, and more orthodox than the people around him feared he had become. This is why her story should not be mistaken for a calm ending to the marriage sequence. Catherine Parr was not safe because Henry had mellowed. She was safe because she was careful, and because fortune did not abandon her at the crucial moment. Her success also throws the earlier queens into sharper relief. Catherine of Aragon survived as long as she did because she had rank, dignity, and conviction. But those same qualities made her impossible for Henry to erase quietly. Anne Boleyn rose through brilliance and influence, but her visibility became fatal when the king turned. Jane Seymour gave Henry the son he wanted, and died before disappointment could reach her. Anne of Cleves survived by yielding almost completely. Catherine Howard lacked the experience, protection, and caution needed to survive the court that consumed her. Catherine Parr understood the pattern. She lived inside its lessons. She knew that a queen could not rely on affection alone. She knew that the king's favor was a room with hidden doors. She knew that the wrong conversation might become accusation. She knew that being right was less important than allowing Henry to feel unchallenged, and this knowledge shaped everything she did. Her relationship with Mary, Elizabeth, and Edward remains one of the most important parts of her legacy. Through Catherine Parr, Elizabeth in particular gained an example of a learned, politically alert woman navigating power with discipline. Elizabeth would later become a master of controlled speech, religious ambiguity, and royal image-making. It would be too simple to credit Catherine Parr alone for that education, but it is hard not to see the connection. Elizabeth grew up watching women survive or die according to how power interpreted them. Catherine Parr showed one version of survival that did not require emptiness. A woman could think, a woman could write, a woman could influence, but she had to choose her moments. Mary, too, benefited from Catherine's presence, though their religious paths would diverge sharply. Edward, the heir, moved within a household where his stepmother valued learning and Protestant-leaning devotion. In all three children, Catherine Parr's influence belongs less to spectacle than to formation. She helped create a family setting in which the Tudor future could imagine itself educated, purposeful, and legitimate again. That was no small achievement in a house so often trained by fear. Still, there is sadness in the kind of victory Catherine achieved. She did not reform Henry's heart. She did not end the machinery of suspicion. She did not make the court gentle. She survived by moving skillfully through danger, not by making danger vanish. Her queenship was a lesson in emotional discipline under pressure, and perhaps that is why it feels more adult than romantic. She was the last queen standing, but standing required silence at the right time. It required humility, whether felt or performed. It required accepting that the king's mind was a place no one could enter safely without an exit prepared. When Henry neared death, Catherine Parr remained part of the fragile arrangement that would outlive him. The children were back within the imagined Tudor future. Edward stood first. Mary and Elizabeth, despite everything, had not been erased. The family Henry had fractured was being gathered into a final legal and symbolic shape. Catherine helped make that possible. And yet, her success only deepens the central contradiction. Henry needed a woman's intelligence to repair the family damage created by his own fear of women's failure. He needed Catherine Parr's steadiness after years of treating queens as replaceable instruments of succession. He needed her tact to bring his daughters near again after he had allowed their legitimacy to rise and fall with his marriages. In the final years, the king who had demanded absolute control depended on the careful diplomacy of a wife who knew better than to seem in control. That may be Catherine Parr's secret history. Not that she escaped danger by luck alone. Not that she was merely gentle enough to survive. But that she understood Henry's court as a place where truth itself needed a costume. She wore hers well. In the final years, Henry's body became part of the politics of England. This is not merely a physical detail, though the physical detail matters. The king, who had once staged himself as youth, strength, and magnificence, was now ill, heavy, often in pain, and increasingly difficult for those around him to manage. His old athletic image had not disappeared from memory. It had become a kind of accusation. The body, that once promised dynastic vigor, now reminded the court that the future was approaching faster than anyone could comfortably say aloud. A dying king is never only a man dying. He is a question. Who will rule after him? Who will control the child heir? Which religion will shape the next reign? Which faction will reach the new king first? Who will be punished before the old king is gone? Who will be remembered as loyal, and who will be reclassified, perhaps too late, as dangerous? In Henry's last years, those questions gathered around every doorway. Edward was the answer Henry had spent so much of his reign pursuing. But Edward was still young. That single fact made the future unstable. A minor king could inherit the crown, but he could not govern alone. Around him would gather counselors, relatives, religious factions, and noble ambitions, all claiming to act for the good of the realm while also protecting their own place in it. The birth of a prince had not ended politics. It had prepared the next contest. Mary and Elizabeth complicated the picture in a different way. Henry had damaged both of them. He had allowed each daughter to be declared illegitimate. He had made their status dependent on the rise and fall of their mothers. He had forced Mary into submission after years of pressure. He had left Elizabeth to grow beneath the shadow of Anne Boleyn's execution. Yet in the end, he needed them. This is one of the sharpest ironies of the Tudor story. After years of degrading his daughter's legitimacy, Henry placed them back into the line of succession, not above Edward, never above the son, but behind him as necessary supports in case the male line failed. The arrangement did not fully heal their status, and it did not erase the legal contradictions that had shaped their childhoods, but it acknowledged something Henry could no longer avoid. The Tudor future might depend on the very daughters he had spent years making uncertain. The king who wanted a simple line left behind a sequence: Edward first, then Mary, then Elizabeth, a family order rebuilt after being repeatedly broken. There is something almost grimly practical about it. Henry could be cruel, proud, self-justifying, and suspicious, but he was not incapable of calculation. By restoring Mary and Elizabeth to the succession through statute and will, he gave England a broader Tudor path. He also tried, in his final way, to keep control after death. The will was not merely a document. It was Henry's last attempt to arrange the living from beyond the grave. And yet, even this final act carried the marks of the damage that came before. Mary was included, but not as the unquestioned legitimate daughter of Catherine of Aragon. Elizabeth was included, but not as the unquestioned legitimate daughter of Anne Boleyn. They were placed in line because the king's authority made it so. Their right rested less on the simple security of birth than on the last architecture of their father's command. Henry had spent his life trying to make legitimacy certain. He ended by making it conditional on his own will. That contradiction is not a small legal curiosity. It reveals the emotional structure of his reign. Henry did not merely want heirs. He wanted heirs he could define. A daughter could be raised, lowered, restored, and still expected to be grateful for the restoration. A son could be treasured as the centerpiece of the dynasty, while the people around him waited nervously to see which adults would rule in his name. Family, at the end, remained something Henry arranged rather than something he trusted. Meanwhile, the court around the failing king grew more dangerous. Factional struggles sharpened as Henry weakened. Men who had survived for years by serving his will now had to think about the next reign without appearing disloyal to this one. Religious conservatives and reformers maneuvered around the future Edward VI, whose education and advisors mattered enormously. Catherine Parr herself had nearly been caught in the religious struggles of the court. Others were not so fortunate. The final years of Henry's reign did not feel like a peaceful settling of accounts. They felt like a room where everyone could hear the clock, and no one knew whose name would be spoken before it stopped. Illness changed the king's presence. Pain can narrow a person's world. It can make patience thin, suspicion sharper, pride more brittle. We should be cautious about explaining Henry's cruelty only through illness. He had made destructive choices long before his final decline. But his physical suffering likely intensified the atmosphere around him. A king in pain, surrounded by ambitious men, holding unresolved religious tensions and a fragile succession in his hands, was not a soft figure fading gently into memory. He remained dangerous. Even near death, Henry's authority could still ruin lives. That is why the image of the sick king is so unsettling. It reverses the usual fantasy of power. We might expect physical weakness to make a ruler less frightening. In Henry's case, weakness made the question of access more important. Who could speak to him? Who could influence him? Who could present a document, block a petition, carry a rumor, delay a meeting, soften an accusation, sharpen one. The king's body became a guarded political site. The man who had once dominated the court by motion now dominated it by proximity. Those closest to him could shape the last decisions of the reign. Those excluded could fall without even understanding how the ground had moved. Around the royal chamber, ambition did not disappear beneath solemnity. It became quieter, more careful, more devout in its language, perhaps, but no less active. And through it all, Henry still imagined himself as the master of the succession. He had reason to believe he had accomplished something. He had a son. He had 2 daughters restored behind that son. He had broken papal authority in England. He had enriched the crown through religious change. He had crushed visible opposition. He had forced Parliament, churchmen, nobles, wives, children, and ministers to bend around the central fact of his kingship. From one angle, his will had triumphed. From another, it had merely postponed the reckoning. Because a succession written on paper is not the same as a stable dynasty. Edward's youth remained a danger. Mary's Catholic faith would matter. Elizabeth's parentage would matter. The religious settlement Henry left behind was neither fully one thing nor the other, and those ambiguities would not stay quiet. The people who had obeyed Henry in life would soon begin arguing over what obedience meant after him. A king can command a realm. He cannot command the future to remain still. That is the truth Henry's final years expose with almost cruel clarity. He had used law as if law could settle every human uncertainty. He had treated marriage as if a different wife could solve a dynastic terror. He had treated daughters as if their legitimacy could be adjusted without consequence. He had treated ministers as tools, queens as vessels, cousins as possible threats, and religious authority as something to be relocated into his own crown. And still, at the end, he could not escape uncertainty. He could only write instructions. The final will stands, therefore, as both an assertion and a confession. It asserts Henry's power to shape the succession. It confesses that the succession still required shaping. It restores Mary and Elizabeth because excluding them had become too risky. It places Edward first because the dream of the male heir still ruled Henry's imagination. It arranges the children in an order that looks firm, but beneath it lie all the fractures of the previous decades. A dead queen behind Mary, an executed queen behind Elizabeth, a dead mother behind Edward, and behind all 3, a father who had wounded each child differently in the name of preserving them. That is the family Henry left waiting at the edge of his death. Not a clean dynasty, a settlement, not peace, an arrangement. The difference matters. Peace would have meant trust, recognition, and some sense that the family could continue without reopening every injury. An arrangement meant that everyone knew where they stood for the moment, because the law said so, because the will said so, because the king had finally decided it. But arrangements are fragile when they rest on fear. Once the hand that enforced them is gone, people begin to test the seams. Henry died in January 1547. The king, who had filled his palaces with command, left behind a child, 2 daughters, competing factions, unfinished religious conflict, and a dynasty that still depended on bodies more fragile than the documents written about them. His death did not end the story. It released it. For decades, Henry had tried to force certainty into the Tudor line. In his final act, He appeared to gather the family into order: son, daughter, daughter. But the order was haunted by everything required to produce it. The will could name his children. It could not make them forget. It could not restore their mothers. It could not unmake the humiliations, the interrogations, the laws, the funerals, the careful silences of the court. And perhaps that is why Henry's final years feel less like a conclusion than a dimming lamp before another room is opened. The king had spent his life trying to control what would happen after him, but the future he left behind was not obedient. It was injured. Edward inherited the throne as the answer to Henry's lifelong fear. He was 9 years old. That contrast is almost painfully simple. For decades, Henry had pursued a male heir, as if a son would quiet the past and secure the future. He had broken with Rome, set aside wives, executed one queen, lost another to childbirth, humiliated daughters, destroyed ministers, and watched his court learn the habits of fear. And when the longed-for son finally became king, he was still a child surrounded by adults who understood that ruling in the name of a boy could be its own form of power. Edward VI's reign was brief, but it was not empty. Under his name, England moved more decisively in a Protestant direction. The cautious, uneven religious world Henry had left behind began to change with sharper purpose. Reformers gained influence. Traditional worship was challenged more deeply. The church Henry had taken from papal authority was now pushed further from older Catholic practice. Edward himself was educated in Protestant belief and appears to have taken his religion seriously, even as his youth meant that powerful men governed around him. This is one of the strange outcomes of Henry's life. He had not broken with Rome in order to create the exact religious future his son's reign pursued. Henry's own beliefs remained more conservative than many later reformers wished. But by claiming supremacy over the English church, he had opened a door through which others could walk much farther. The king who wanted control had created a structure that could be used after him by people with different convictions. Even his revolution would not remain obedient. Edward's minority also exposed the weakness beneath Henry's dynastic dream. A boy king needed protectors, and protectors became rivals. Edward Seymour, Duke of Somerset, rose first as Lord Protector, ruling in the king's name. Then John Dudley, Duke of Northumberland, displaced him. These were not merely personal contests between ambitious men. They were struggles over the direction of the realm, the shape of religion, the handling of unrest, and control of the living symbol Henry had left behind. Edward was king, but kingship in childhood can be a crown worn inside a cage built by others. Then came illness. For Henry, the male heir had represented security. For England, Edward's fragile health revived the old terror with cruel speed. The boy who had been treated as the solution became, in his sickness, the beginning of another succession crisis. The question Henry had tried so hard to settle returned almost immediately. Who comes next? By his father's arrangement, the answer should have been Mary, then Elizabeth. But Mary was Catholic. To Protestant leaders around Edward, her accession threatened reversal. The religious future they had built under Edward might be undone by the daughter of Catherine of Aragon, the girl Henry had once forced into submission, now grown into a woman who had never abandoned the faith of her mother. So, before Edward died, a new plan was attempted. The succession was diverted toward Lady Jane Grey, a Protestant claimant with Tudor blood through Henry's younger sister's line. The attempt failed. It failed quickly. Mary moved with a decisiveness that startled her enemies. Support gathered around her, not simply because everyone loved her or agreed with her religion, but because she had the stronger claim in the minds of many. She was Henry's daughter. She had been named in the succession. She represented lawful inheritance against what looked like manipulation by Northumberland and his circle. The girl once pushed aside for Anne Boleyn's child now rode toward power as the rightful queen. There is a deep emotional reversal here. Mary had spent much of her youth being told, by law and pressure, that her identity must bend to her father's will. Yet the authority that restored her claim also came from Henry. His final settlement, imperfect and contradictory as it was, gave her a path back. The father who humiliated her had also, at the end, made it possible for her to inherit. Tudor history is full of such bitter ironies. Mary became queen in 1553, the first woman to rule England in her own right. That fact alone should not be rushed past. Many had doubted whether a woman could govern. Many had feared female succession as a path to disorder, foreign influence, or factional chaos. Mary's accession proved that a queen regnant could take the throne, command loyalty, and act with royal authority. But her reign was troubled from the beginning. She sought to restore England to Catholicism and reunite the realm with Rome. To her, this was not simply policy. It was restoration, justice, and spiritual repair. The religious changes under Edward had not merely offended her. They had threatened the world in which her mother's marriage, her own legitimacy, and the older unity of Christendom made sense. Mary's Catholicism cannot be separated from her biography. For her, faith and memory were intertwined. Yet the realm had changed. England in Mary's adulthood was not the England of her childhood. Reform had taken root in places. Property once belonging to monasteries had passed into lay hands. Political elites had learned to benefit from the new order. Religious identity had become sharper, more dangerous, and more personal. Mary's attempt to reverse the tide required force, law, persuasion, and punishment. The burnings of Protestants during her reign would stain her memory for centuries. They also show how Henry's legacy continued to poison the family after his death. Mary had learned from a father who made conscience a matter of state power. Henry had demanded obedience to his supremacy. Edward's government had advanced Protestant reform through authority. Mary, in turn, used royal power to restore the old faith and punish those she saw as heretics. The religious violence of her reign was her own responsibility, but it grew in soil Henry had broken open. The family had inherited not only a crown, it had inherited a method. Mary's marriage to Philip of Spain deepened fear among many subjects. Here again, the old anxieties about female rule returned. Would England be drawn under foreign influence? Would a queen's husband command too much? Would the country become part of a larger Catholic design? Mary's hopes for marriage were political, religious, and personal, and perhaps also filled with a longing for the secure family life denied to her youth. But she had no surviving child. Her pregnancies, or what were believed to be pregnancies, ended in humiliation and grief. The echoes are almost unbearable. Catherine of Aragon's daughter, whose life had been wounded because her mother did not give Henry a surviving son, now suffered her own public reproductive disappointments. Once again, A queen's body became national weather. Once again, hope gathered around the possibility of an heir. Once again, failure became political danger. Mary died in 1558. Then came Elizabeth, the daughter of Anne Boleyn, once declared illegitimate after her mother's execution, inherited the throne that Henry had nearly written her out of. Her accession was not merely a change of monarch. It was the return of a question Henry had tried to bury. What becomes of the child of the executed queen? Elizabeth answered by ruling. Her reign would become long, complex, and carefully staged. She inherited religious division, financial pressures, foreign threats, and the unresolved problem of marriage. From the beginning, people expected her to marry. A queen should marry, they said, because a kingdom needed heirs. A queen should marry because counselors feared instability. A queen should marry because female authority still made many men uncomfortable unless it could be anchored to a husband. Elizabeth understood the trap better than most. She had watched marriage destroy women. Her mother had died because marriage to Henry became politically fatal. Catherine Howard had died after failing the impossible image her marriage required. Catherine Parr survived by disciplined self-management. Mary's marriage to Philip had brought suspicion and disappointment. Elizabeth's own childhood had taught her that a woman's body, reputation, and household could become matters of state surveillance. So Elizabeth turned unmarried rule into political art. Whether from personal preference, political caution, trauma, strategy, or some blend that cannot be untangled fully, she did not marry. She made courtship a tool of diplomacy without surrendering herself to a husband. She cultivated the image of the Virgin Queen, transforming the absence of a child into a symbol of devotion to the realm. It was brilliant, but it came at a dynastic cost. She left no heir of her body, and with that, the Tudor line ended. This is the final irony of Henry VIII's obsession. He spent much of his reign chasing biological certainty. He wanted sons. He wanted a line. He wanted a future carried through his blood so securely that England would never again face the shadow of civil conflict. And for a time he seemed to have achieved enough. Edward, Mary, Elizabeth, 3 children, each in turn wearing the crown, but none of them left children. Edward died young. Mary died childless. Elizabeth ruled magnificently and died childless. The dynasty Henry tried so violently to preserve passed through all 3 of his heirs and then vanished into another line. The crown moved to James VI of Scotland, who became James I of England, descended from Henry VII through Margaret Tudor. The Tudor name gave way to the Stuart. The family Henry had tried to control had carried the monarchy across a dangerous century, but it had not continued itself. What then did Henry win? He prevented immediate collapse in his own lifetime. He produced a son who became king. He restored his daughters to a succession that allowed the Tudor crown to pass in sequence rather than fall at once into open civil war. In that limited sense, his arrangements worked. The crown did not immediately shatter after him. England did not return to the Wars of the Roses. But the deeper victory he wanted escaped him. He did not create lasting Tudor continuity. He did not create a peaceful family line. He did not produce heirs free from the damage of his methods. His children inherited not only his throne, but the wreckage of his fear. Religious division, questions of legitimacy, the memory of executed queens, and the habit of turning private conscience into public law. Each child ruled in the shadow of a mother Henry had used, lost, rejected, or destroyed. Each carried a different fragment of his history. Edward carried Jane's death and the hopes of Protestant reformers. Mary carried Catherine's humiliation and the wound of religious displacement. Elizabeth carried Anne's execution and the lifelong knowledge that survival required mastery of image, silence, and timing. They were not merely successors, they were evidence that Henry's obsession had achieved power without peace, evidence that a dynasty can survive a ruler's lifetime and still fail the test of permanence, evidence that children raised as instruments of succession become human beings with memories, convictions, and scars of their own. In the end, the Tudor future did arrive, but it did not arrive in the form Henry imagined. It arrived as a sickly boy king used by factions, a Catholic queen haunted by legitimacy and loss, and a Protestant queen who turned refusal into sovereignty. It arrived brilliantly, violently, uncertainly, and childlessly. The wreckage ruled England for more than half a century. Then it ended. Henry VIII did not fail because he lacked power. That is the first thing to understand. He had more power than most English kings before him could have imagined exercising so directly. He bent Parliament to his needs. He broke the authority of Rome in his realm. He made bishops, nobles, ministers, monks, wives, and children answer to the force of his conscience. He transformed marriage into law, law into obedience, and obedience into a test from which no one near him could fully escape. He won, again and again, in the immediate sense. Catherine of Aragon was removed. Anne Boleyn was destroyed. Jane Seymour gave him the sun. Anne of Cleves yielded. Catherine Howard was condemned. Catherine Parr survived by caution. Mary and Elizabeth were lowered, restored, and arranged. Cromwell rose, served, and fell. Margaret Pole and other figures of dangerous blood were eliminated or broken by the fear surrounding succession. If we read only the surface of events, Henry appears as the man who always found a way through. A king denied by Rome simply made himself supreme over the English Church. A husband trapped in one marriage made another. A father disappointed by daughters kept searching until a son was born. A ruler threatened by old bloodlines cut them back. A man embarrassed by ministers or wives found legal language sharp enough to protect his pride. But the deeper record is less obedient to him, because control is not the same as security, and fear, even when armed with a crown, does not become wisdom. The family Henry tried to command became the evidence against him, not because every one of them was innocent in every political sense, and not because the Tudor court was a simple stage of victims and villain. The truth is more difficult than that. Catherine of Aragon could be stubborn. Anne Boleyn could be polarizing. Mary could be severe. Elizabeth could be evasive. Cromwell could be ruthless. Noble families could be ambitious. Religious conflict was real. Succession was a genuine danger in a country with fresh memories of civil war. Henry's world was not imaginary, but his solution to that world was catastrophic. He tried to cure uncertainty by dominating the people who embodied it. A wife's fertility became a verdict on her worth. A daughter's legitimacy became a tool of marital policy. A cousin's ancestry became a possible crime waiting for evidence. A minister's usefulness lasted only until the king needed someone to blame. Love, service, blood, memory, all were made conditional, because Henry's deepest loyalty was not to the family in front of him, but to the dynasty he imagined beyond them. That is the central contradiction. He destroyed human bonds in the name of preserving a bloodline. He wanted heirs, but wounded the children he already had. He wanted queens, but made queenship nearly impossible. He wanted loyalty, but built a court where trust was irrational. He wanted a future, but taught the future to fear him. The final Tudor story makes this contradiction impossible to ignore. Edward, Mary, and Elizabeth each inherited the crown, but none continued the line. The son died young. The elder daughter reigned without leaving a child. The younger daughter ruled brilliantly, cautiously, and childlessly. The dynasty survived Henry, but not for long. It passed through the very children whose status he had damaged, and then it ended. There is a quiet judgment in that, not a supernatural punishment. History rarely offers such tidy morality, but a judgment of consequence. Henry's methods produced obedience, not wholeness. They produced succession, not permanence. They produced silence, not peace. And silence was everywhere by the end. Imagine the court after years of this reign, not as a place of constant screaming terror, because that would be too easy. Imagine something more controlled and more believable. Polished floors, formal greetings, trained faces, courtiers who knew when to kneel and when to disappear, servants who remembered which names were no longer safe, children who learned that a father's favor could arrive as warmth and leave as law, women who understood that the crown on a queen's head could become evidence against her body, men who had watched too many powerful servants fall to believe completely in their own importance. This was the emotional world Henry left behind, a world where everyone had learned to survive him. And survival is not the same as loyalty, though tyrants often mistake the two. The tragedy of Henry VIII is not that he wanted a dynasty. In his time, that desire was expected. A stable succession mattered. England had reason to fear contested crowns. A king could not think of marriage and children as purely private matters. To pretend otherwise would be unfair to the age. The tragedy is that Henry's fear became larger than his judgment. It taught him to see people as solutions. Catherine of Aragon would solve alliance and legitimacy. Anne Boleyn would solve desire and renewal. Jane Seymour would solve the heir. Anne of Cleves would solve diplomacy. Catherine Howard would solve age and embarrassment. Catherine Parr would solve comfort, care, and family repair. Mary, Elizabeth, and Edward would solve the future. But people do not remain solutions. They resist. They age. They disappoint. They remember. They believe. They become inconveniently human. Henry could not forgive that, or perhaps he could not afford to. By the time his reign ended, the palace had become a kind of archive, not only of laws and inventories, but of emotional damage. Each marriage left a residue. Each execution altered what was imaginable. Each act of restoration failed to erase the act of humiliation before it. When Mary became queen, she carried Catherine's wound. When Elizabeth became queen, she carried Anne's shadow. When Edward became king, he carried Jane's absence and Henry's impossible hope. The children did not simply inherit England. They inherited their father's unfinished argument with uncertainty, and in different ways, each answered it. Edward through reformers who pushed the religious changes further than Henry had intended. Mary through restoration, punishment, and a longing to repair the world that had dishonored her mother. Elizabeth through discipline, image, delay, and the refusal to let marriage place her inside another man's power. None of these reigns can be reduced to Henry. They belong to Edward, Mary, and Elizabeth themselves, but none can be fully separated from the house that made them. The Tudor children ruled like people who had learned early that identity was political, that belief could be dangerous, and that survival required command of the story told about you. Henry had wanted heirs. He got rulers. That may be the most unexpected legacy of all. His daughters, especially, became stronger than the categories he tried to place around them. Mary, whom he had pressured and diminished, took the throne against those who tried to bypass her. Elizabeth, whose mother he had erased as wife and condemned as traitor, became the most enduring Tudor monarch in memory. The daughter of the executed queen outlived the son for whom the kingdom had been broken open. History has a dry sense of balance sometimes, but even Elizabeth's brilliance could not give Henry what he had truly wanted: lasting Tudor continuity. When she died, the crown passed away from his direct line. The dynasty that had consumed so many lives in the effort to preserve itself had burned brightly, then gone out. So what remains of Henry VIII? Not only the portraits, not only the 6 wives, not only the break with Rome, not only the scaffold. What remains is a warning about power when it becomes afraid of ordinary human limits: the limit of the body, the limit of childbirth, the limit of law, the limit of obedience, the limit of a child's ability to forgive, the limit of a family's capacity to survive being treated as an instrument of state. Henry tried to master all of it. He could not. He could command proclamations, but not love. He could arrange succession, but not permanence. He could punish disobedience, but not erase memory. He could make people call him supreme, but he couldn't make the future belong to him. That is why the story still unsettles us. Not because Henry was uniquely cruel in every possible way, and not because his court was the only dangerous court in Europe. It unsettles us because his life reveals how easily public necessity can become private obsession, and how easily private obsession can dress itself in the language of national survival. A king says he is protecting the realm. A husband says he is obeying conscience. A father says he is securing the future. A ruler says the law requires what he already wants. And one by one, the people closest to him pay the cost of agreeing, resisting, or simply existing in the way. In the end, Henry VIII did preserve the Tudor crown for another generation. That much is true. His children ruled after him, and the kingdom did not collapse the moment he died. His will for a time held, but the family he tried to control became something he could not govern from the grave. They became witnesses. Mary witnessed what happened to a daughter when a father's marriage needed rewriting. Elizabeth witnessed what happened to a child when a mother's name became dangerous. Edward witnessed, though briefly, the crushing expectations placed on a son born to repair a dynasty, and through them Henry's reign continued not as triumph, but as consequence. That is the secret history behind the familiar one. Behind the wives, there were children learning fear. Behind the laws, There were rooms where people measured their words. Behind the dynasty, there was a family broken to preserve a name that would vanish anyway. Henry won obedience in life, but he could not control what his life would mean. And when the last Tudor died childless, the silence that followed was not empty. It was the sound of the dynasty finally answering the king who had tried to command it.